My name is Aaron Vale, and for 11 weeks I worked nights at a radio relay site in the Nevada desert. It was not the kind of job people usually ask follow-up questions about. If I said I was doing maintenance security for a tower outside Ely, most people assumed I meant sitting in a truck with a flashlight and a thermos, keeping copper thieves away from utility equipment. That was part of it. The rest was quieter. The company had a contract to keep a regional broadcast repeater online through storm season. The tower handled FM traffic, county alerts, and a few emergency channels that mattered more than the music station riding on the same structure. There had been a run of strange outages in late summer. Not full failures, short drops, light alarms, unexplained load spikes after midnight. They wanted someone on site until the hardware could be upgraded in the fall. I took the job because I had done telecom work before, and because I needed 3 steady months without talking to many people. The site sat in a shallow basin of pale dirt and black volcanic stone, about 40 miles from the nearest town and 10 miles from the nearest real road. The last stretch was a service track with no markings except tire cuts in the dust, and a few leaning posts with faded reflectors. The tower itself stood on a low rise above the basin, taller than anything around it by a long measure, a red and white lattice structure with aviation lights at intervals and a crown of dishes and antenna arrays that caught the evening sun like dull glass. At the base of the rise, there was a fenced compound with a cinder block equipment room, a diesel generator shed, a water tank on metal legs, and a narrow prefab sleeping trailer that had been painted white at some point and then left to yellow in the heat. The fence was topped with tired coils of wire that had more dust than purpose on them. A microwave dish faced east. Another faced south. The whole place hummed lightly in a way I stopped noticing after the first week. My shift began at 6 in the evening and ended at 6 in the morning. I checked the fuel levels, logged transmitter temperatures, walked the fence line, and cleared the daily alarms from a monitor mounted in the equipment room. At 9, midnight, 3, and 5 I did physical rounds. Most of the alarms were ordinary. Cooling fans drawing uneven current. A weather seal working loose on a cabinet. Voltage dipping when the generator exercised itself. The tower had been standing there for decades. Old structures develop habits. The desert did the rest. In daylight, it looked wide and honest. Everything was exposed. Dry channels cut through the basin floor. Low greasewood and rabbit brush sat in scattered patches. Far ridges lifted in long blue shelves that made the distance look simpler than it was. By afternoon, the heat flattened the air until the tower seemed to tremble at the edges. At night, the same place felt larger and less specific. The ground turned gray. The ridges lost their shape. The tower lights became the only organized thing in view. Red lamps pulsed at steady intervals up the steel, and when the air was clear, you could follow the structure by light alone. A vertical line broken into patient markers against the dark. I got used to that line very quickly. A tower at night is not silent. The steel settles after sunset. The guide masts sing in the wind, though ours was self-supporting and had no wires, only its own weight and bracing and the occasional complaint from a loose access panel. Insects hit the security light over the equipment room. Small animals moved in the scrub. Once or twice a week, coyotes sounded off somewhere beyond the basin, not close enough to matter. I slept better there than I had in town. The quiet was simple. If something made a sound, it usually had a reason. The days belonged to heat and maintenance. The nights belonged to routine. Around 7 each evening, I climbed the first service ladder to inspect the lower obstruction lights and the cable run where it entered the base conduit. I never went higher than the first platform. That part was for certified riggers, and my contract did not pay for pretending otherwise. At 10, I made coffee in the trailer and watched the tower through the west window while the monitor screens reflected green and amber over the glass. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, if the air stayed still, I could hear the faint carrier hum from the transmitter room before I opened the door. Nothing about the first 4 nights seemed unusual. Then the day tech left me a notebook. Her name was Lena Ortiz. She had been on the site through August, working day maintenance until the company found someone willing to take the nights alone. She was in her 30s, compact, quiet, and the sort of person who tightened straps and closed cases with the same economy of movement. On my first evening, she walked me through the site without wasting words. She showed me how the transfer switch sometimes stuck if the generator tested during a dust gust. She showed me which monitor alarms could wait until morning and which ones needed a reset right away. She showed me the breaker panel in the equipment room and the small insulated hook hanging beside it. Then, when we were done, she set a spiral notebook on the desk beside the radio and said, "Read the last page before midnight." I asked what it was. "Things people learn slowly out here." "That official?" "No." She said it without humor, which was useful. A lot of remote site jobs come with bad jokes from the outgoing crew. This did not feel like that. "Should I be worried?" I asked. "Not if you can leave some things alone." That was the longest thing she said about it. She drove out just before sunset, her truck kicking a pale ribbon behind it that hung over the service track for a long time after the sound had gone. When the dust settled, the basin looked the same as before. That was one of the oddities of the place. A person could leave it, and the place did not seem altered by their absence. I read the notebook at 11:40 that night. Most of it was maintenance shorthand, part numbers, fuel deliveries, gate code changes, notes about a failed fan unit in July. The last page was written in a different hand, probably Lena's, though the lettering was slower than the entries before it. There were 4 rules. No explanation, no date, just the rules. Rule 1. If you hear climbing on the tower after midnight, do not use the searchlight. Watch the beacon rhythm instead. If the sound keeps going after the 3rd red lamp, stay inside until it stops. Rule 2. If fine sand appears along the north wall inside the equipment room, leave it where it is until sunrise. Do not open the roof hatch during the same night. Rule 3. If the top aviation light goes out for less than 1 minute and then returns, do not reset any breakers. Wait for the next scheduled check. Rule 4. If the tower begins to ring through the steel after 2 a.m., do not stand in the yard and do not go under the structure for any reason unless the county channel goes dark. Below the 4th rule, in smaller writing, was one more line. It usually stays with the height, unless you give it a reason not to. That was all. I read the page twice, then put the notebook back on the desk, and made the mistake most people make when they are handed instructions without context. I assumed there was a practical reason under the superstition. Remote sites collect folk rules. Do not leave boots outside because bark scorpions like the shade. Do not run the generator with the south louver shut, or it will pull dust into the cabinet. Do not stand under the microwave dish in a storm. A lot of advice sounds strange before it becomes habit. At 12:18 a.m., while I was in the trailer rinsing my coffee cup, I heard metal take weight. The sound came from outside, high and hollow. Not a loose panel and not wind. It was the steady sequence of load moving up a ladder cage. One step, pause, another, pause. It was a familiar industrial sound. I had worked with tower crews before. Climbers make a structure speak in sections. Weight shifts, bolts answer, and the steel resolves each movement half a second after the body has already gone higher. It is very distinct when you know it. I set the cup down and went to the trailer window. The tower stood under its red lights, clean against the dark. The first lamp pulsed above the lower platform. The second was higher up where the cross bracing tightened. The third hung near the midpoint where the structure narrowed before rising to the top arrays. There was no one visible on the ladder cage. The climbing sound continued. The searchlight sat by the trailer door, a rechargeable flood unit strong enough to pick out fence posts at 300 yards. I looked at it. Then I remembered the first rule. Instead of taking the light, I stood in the dark window and watched the red lamps. The climbing was slow, not like a thief, not like a lineman, not like anyone working. Whoever was making the sound moved with long, regular pauses, as if the act itself mattered more than reaching the top. When the noise passed the level of the first red lamp, I felt something shift in the way I was hearing it. The sound did not seem to travel up the face of the tower the way a person would climb. It moved through the steel from inside it, ladder to bracing to platform, with none of the casual imbalance human movement leaves behind. I waited for a shape to cross the red light. Nothing did. The sound rose past the second lamp, then the third. The rule had said, if the sound keeps going after the third red lamp, stay inside until it stops. So I stayed where I was. The climbing went on for another 2 or 3 minutes above the highest light I could track. Then it stopped somewhere near the crown of the tower where the dishes were mounted, and the dark became too crowded to separate steel from sky. I stood there another 15 minutes before I realized I was holding my breath in shallow intervals, matching the pace of the thing I had heard. In the morning, I inspected the base of the tower for prank signs. There were none. The gate to the compound was still locked. Fence mesh intact. No tire marks beyond my own and Lena's. The lower ladder was caged and padlocked as always, though a faint dusting of pale grit had gathered on the first rung inside the cage, higher than the wind should have carried it. That afternoon, when Lena called to ask if the transfer switch had behaved, I mentioned the climbing. She was quiet a moment. You used the light? No. Good. That happens often? Often enough. What is it? Night load, she said, as if the phrase were enough to file the event under. Just follow the page. Then she moved on to fuel deliveries and signed off. I did not press. Out there, people sometimes stop talking because they have nothing to say. Other times they stop because what they know would not help. For the next 3 nights, the climbing came back. Never at the same minute, but always after midnight. Always slow. Always steady. Once it began at 12:07. Once at 1:11. Once not until nearly 2. Each time I watched the red lamps instead of using the floodlight. Each time the sound moved above the third beacon and disappeared into the upper dark. The tower looked empty every night. That matters. If I had seen a person, even briefly, I could have placed the event in one category or another. Trespasser, drifter, some local with more nerve than sense. But the empty tower left no simple place to put the sound. The steel was carrying effort with no body attached to it. The desert has a way of letting you accept small impossibilities if they arrive on schedule. You still notice them. You simply stop expecting an immediate answer. Rule 2 came into it on the 6th night. The equipment room was a cinder block structure with a sealed concrete floor, 2 intake fans, a steel desk, the rack cabinets, and a roof hatch that opened by inside lever for daytime inspection of the conduit run. It stayed cool enough at night that the smell of electronics and dust settled low against the walls. At 3 a.m., I went in to log transmitter temperatures and found a thin line of fine sand running along the north wall. It looked at first like wind-blown grit from a bad door sweep. That would have been ordinary, except the sand was inside the weather seal, not near the threshold. It had gathered below a section of wall with no window, no vent, and no visible gap. The grains were pale and very fine, almost white, unlike the darker basin dust outside. I crouched to look at it and saw that the line was not straight. It narrowed, widened, then broke into short ovals like marks made by the ends of fingers dragged close together. I am aware of how that sounds. At the time, I did not think finger marks. I thought only that it looked deliberate in a way spilled sand does not. The roof hatch was directly above that section of wall. Rule 2 came back to me then. If fine sand appears along the north wall inside the equipment room, leave it where it is until sunrise. Do not open the roof hatch during the same night I left it where it was. At dawn, when I returned with a dustpan, the line had spread a few inches farther along the base of the wall and stopped beneath the tool cabinet. There were no prints crossing the floor, no trail from the door, nothing above it on the painted blocks. I swept it up. The sand felt dry and cold in the pan, despite the room already warming with the day. After that, I began checking the north wall before I looked at the monitors. Some nights there was nothing. Some nights the pale line appeared again after midnight, always in a slightly different pattern, never more than a few feet long. I tested every obvious cause I could think of. I checked the vent screens, the conduit seals, the door threshold, the hatch gasket. Nothing explained it. A week into the job, I made a second mistake. Not a large one. Just enough to confirm the rules had teeth. The climbing began later than usual that night, around 1:40, and I was tired from a day spent helping a county tech replace a failing battery bank. The wind had been up all evening, scraping the side of the trailer with blown grit. When the tower started taking weight, I was in no mood to stand in the dark and watch red lights blink like a patient. So I picked up the floodlight and stepped just outside the trailer door. I did not aim the beam high. I only meant to sweep the lower cage, satisfy myself there was no one on the structure, and go back inside. The white beam crossed the tower base, the locked ladder, the first platform, the red-painted diagonal braces, and a section of empty steel. Then it stopped on something above the first platform. Not a person, not clearly. What I saw was a pale shape pressed close to the inside of the lattice, long where a body should have been compact, with one jointed length bent around a brace at an angle that looked wrong for a knee or an elbow. The light hit it and turned the surface matte, like dust on dry cloth. For an instant, I had the impression of hands, several of them, one above another on the same vertical line. Then the climbing sound stopped completely. The whole tower went still. I lowered the light at once. I do not mean I chose to lower it. My arm simply did it. For several seconds there was nothing. No steel complaint. No wind. The red lamps continued their slow pulse. I remember hearing the faint hum from the generator shed, and farther out, a night insect clicking against the fence. Then, from somewhere above me and far higher than the beam had reached, there came one sharp, metallic knock. Not random, not settling steel, a single clean strike on the tower frame. I went back into the trailer, shut the door, and turned off the floodlight. The climbing did not resume that night. At 2:26 a.m., I found a pale drift of fine sand on the trailer threshold inside the door, although I was certain it had not been there before I stepped out. When Lena came by 2 days later with filters and a fuel invoice, I told her I had used the searchlight. She set the box down on the desk and looked at me for a long moment. Did it stop? Yes. Did it knock? Yes. She nodded once, almost to herself. What happens if I light it up again? I asked. She adjusted the strap on her tool bag. I don't know. I never did it twice. That was the nearest thing I got to a warning spoken plainly. By then I had fallen into a pattern that felt, if not normal, then at least stable. Nights without climbing seemed incomplete. Nights with no sand at the north wall felt as if the site had skipped a step in its own process. It is easy to let routine grow around a problem when the problem keeps office hours. Rule 3 became important in the third week. The top aviation light was visible from the trailer window as a red point above the higher structure. It flashed in exact time with the lower beacons, and because of the basin's emptiness, it became a sort of clock. I could look up from the log sheet and tell if a few seconds had passed, or half a minute by whether I caught it lit or dark. At 12:53 a.m. on a still Tuesday, the top light failed. It did not fade. It simply went out for perhaps 30 seconds. All the lower lamps remained active. Then the top light came back. Any tower technician will tell you that obstruction lights fail in normal ways. Bulbs age. Controllers hiccup. Moisture gets into housings. But failures usually leave an alarm in the panel, and this one did not. The monitor showed all green. No fault at the controller. No brief voltage drop. No log entry. Rule 3 said not to reset anything if the top light went out for less than a minute, and then returned. So I left the breakers alone and watched. The second time it happened, I understood why the rule existed. The light blinked out again just after 1 o'clock. In the momentary absence of that red point, I could see the outline of the upper tower against the stars more clearly than before. And in that outline, between the third lamp and the crown, there was a thickness the structure should not have had. A vertical irregularity. Something was wrapped along the inside face of the tower, not at the top, but moving past the section where the lamp had gone dark. The red light returned, and the extra thickness disappeared back into the geometry of steel. I stood at the window without moving until the next pulse. When darkness took the lamp again, the shape had shifted lower. That was when I understood the rule in practical terms. The light was not failing because of an electrical issue. Something large enough to matter was passing the lamp housing. Resetting the breakers would not repair the event. It would only announce that I had noticed it. After that, every brief top light outage carried the same implication. Something descending or climbing through the upper structure, close enough to mask the lamp for a few seconds at a time. The tower itself began to change in the way I perceived it. In daylight, it was again steel, paint, rust flecks, cable trays, and stamped serial plates. But at night, I could not look at its verticals without thinking of hold points. Cross braces became places a hand might rest. Service platforms became ledges where something might pause and gather itself. The space inside the lattice felt occupied, even when nothing moved. I still did my rounds. I still logged temperatures and fuel use. I still walked the fence with a flashlight aimed low. But the site had become less empty than it first appeared. Near the end of the month, Rule 4 began. A little after 2 a.m., when the air cooled quickly after a hot day, the tower would sometimes ring. Not loudly, that is important. If it had sounded dramatic, It would have been easier to dismiss as wind in steel. The ringing was delicate, a fine, continuous note threading through the structure, changing pitch as if drawn by pressure along different lengths of metal. At first I thought it was thermal contraction. Old towers make music when temperatures shift. Then one night the note broke into intervals. A light resonance sounded from high in the frame. A second answered lower. Then a third lower still, until the vibration seemed to step down the structure from the crown to the first platform. Not through random cooling, but through sequence. I went to the trailer door and stopped with my hand on the latch. Rule 4 said not to stand in the yard if the tower began to ring through the steel after 2 a.m., and not to go under the structure for any reason unless the county channel went dark. So I stayed inside and listened. The resonance continued downward until it reached the base. Then I heard the chain-link fence near the north corner tremble once, softly, as if someone had rested both hands against it and let go. After that came a faint contact sound from outside the equipment room wall. Not scratching, not knocking. Just a brief dry brush low against the blocks. In the morning, I found a small scatter of pale sand by the north wall inside, though I had checked before dawn and seen none. That is how the rules worked. They did not stop anything. They only kept its movements legible. It climbed when the tower cooled. It passed near the top lamp. It left fine sand in places sealed against weather. And when the structure rang in descending intervals, whatever used the height had come lower than before. I never found a satisfying explanation. There were local stories, but not many, and none of them lined up neatly. One county lineman who came by for a battery test told me there had been a climber killed on the site in the late 90s during a retrofit, but he had no details beyond that. A welder from town said the basin had gypsum seams and old prospect holes, and that white dust came up through cracks after heat lightning. That might have explained the sand if the equipment room had not been poured over bedrock and sealed at the edges. Lena, when I asked once whether she thought it was a person, said, "Not in the useful sense." Then September brought storms. In the desert, storms do not always arrive the way people picture them. Sometimes you see the clouds build all afternoon and watch the light flatten against the basin floor. Sometimes the rain never reaches the ground and only the smell changes. Sometimes the first sign is static, lifting the hair on your arms before the sky does anything visible. The night that forced me outside had been strange since sunset. Heat held in the dirt long past dark. The western ridges vanished behind high cloud. The monitor showed unstable input on one of the county channels and a fault pending on the automatic transfer system. At 11:30, dispatch sent a weather advisory for flash flooding in 2 nearby wash communities. If the repeater site went down, the alert coverage in that sector would narrow badly. By 12:20, the first lightning had begun far south, too distant to hear. The tower lights pulsed against the cloud base, red and patient. I remember thinking the basin looked shallow and metallic, like the whole desert had become a dry seabed under a dark ceiling. The climbing started early at 11:58. It was steady from the start, faster than usual and heavier through the steel. Not louder exactly, but more committed. The structure gave the kind of response you feel in your teeth, even when you are hearing it through glass. I stayed in the trailer and watched the beacons. The sound passed the first lamp, the second, the third. It did not stop at the crown. It continued in shorter intervals, as if whatever was ascending had reached the upper dishes and was moving through them. At 12:14, the top aviation light went out, then the second highest light. For 12 or 15 seconds, the upper tower vanished almost completely, and in its place there was a taller, dark, a vertical band stretching above the last working lamp in a shape the structure did not own. The lights came back, the monitor alarmed at the same time. Auto transfer fault. Generator standby lockout. County AU degraded. I went into the equipment room and checked the panel. No active failure yet, but the transfer system was hanging between states. If utility power dropped in a storm strike, the generator might not pick up the county rack without a manual reset at the shed. That reset was outside. At 12:31, a lightning strike landed somewhere in the basin. Not close, but close enough that the monitors blinked and the room gave a short, hard hum as the conditioning units caught the change. One of the county channels dropped to yellow, then orange. The notebook lay open on the desk because I had checked it earlier, as if reading it once more would give it new lines. Rule 4 was clear. Do not go under the structure for any reason unless the county channel goes dark. At 12:37, the county channel went dark. It was not total silence. The carrier was still there, weak and unstable, but the rack indicator dropped red, and the log began marking missed relay acknowledgments. I stood still for a moment and listened. The tower was ringing. The note started high and moved downward in those same careful steps, like resonance being handed from one section of steel to the next. Outside, the wind had not yet arrived. The storm was still building itself above the basin. There was no obvious external reason for the metal to sing. I took the insulated hook, a flashlight, and my hard hat. I did not take the floodlight. What I remember most about stepping outside was how warm the dark felt. Not hot, just held, as if the air had been waiting. The yard gravel shifted softly under my boots. The generator shed sat beyond the tower base, low and square, with the manual transfer cabinet on its north side. To reach it, I had to cross open ground, pass near the tower's concrete footings, and move beneath at least part of the structure. Above me, something adjusted its weight. I did not look up. That was not bravery. It was simply a practical choice. Looking up would not help me reach the cabinet faster. The tower rang again, lower now. I could hear small showers of grit falling through the steel and landing on the gravel around me with faint, dry ticks. The flashlight stayed aimed at the ground. White dust flecked the beam in scattered lines. Halfway to the shed, the top lamp went out. Then another below it. The darkness over me thickened. I kept walking. When I reached the cabinet, I had to use both hands to throw the outer latch, because fine pale sand had gathered in the lip of the door. Not much, just enough to make metal resist. Inside, the transfer lever sat between positions. I used the insulated hook to pull it cleanly over and held it there until the generator engaged. The diesel caught on the second turn. The sound was abrupt and ordinary. It was the best sound I had heard in weeks. Across the yard, through the wall of the equipment room, I saw the county rack indicators come back from red to amber. Then, from directly above the cabinet roof, I heard the tower stop ringing. The silence that followed had shape to it. I still did not look up. I closed the cabinet, turned, and began walking back toward the trailer with the flashlight aimed low at the gravel. Something touched down behind me. Not heavily. Not with the impact of a body dropping from height. More like a length of dry material settling against itself after being uncoiled. The sound came from the strip of ground between the tower base and the shed. I kept walking. The beam crossed one of the tower footings, a wedge of concrete bolted into the earth. On the face of it, in pale dust, there were marks like handprints only longer than a hand should have been. The fingers too close together and too many joints suggested by the pressure changes. One print over another, climbing down the concrete toward the ground. I passed under the edge of the structure then, and something above me shifted in a slow, sliding way that made the steel answer without fully ringing. I made the mistake of lifting the flashlight a little, only a little, enough to catch the lower bracing inside the lattice. There was a shape folded among the steel at the height of the first platform, not hanging and not standing, but distributed through the structure in narrow, pale lengths, as if the tower had grown an extra set of inner members. Dust coated it, or perhaps dust came from it. I saw one part of it tighten around a brace the way a hand tightens when weight changes. Another section drew upward with quiet precision. Then the light touched something reflective, a buckle, not new metal. Old harness hardware, dull and scratched, caught in or worn by whatever occupied the frame. I lowered the beam at once and kept walking. By the time I reached the trailer, my boots and cuffs were powdered white. I shut the door, locked it, and stood by the window without moving for perhaps a full minute. The yard was empty. The tower lights had all returned. The generator ran steady. The county channel came back green. The storm still had not broken over the basin. At 1:02 a.m., a slow line of pale sand began to appear under the trailer door. Not enough to pour, just enough to gather itself in a patient, thin seam. I stayed inside until dawn. When the sun came up, the basin looked washed, though no rain had fallen. The tower showed nothing out of place from ground level. No bent steel, no harness left hanging. No signs of anyone climbing without gear. At the footing nearest the shed, however, the dust had settled around a long, interrupted pattern, like something kneeling and rising several times in the same spot. Lena came by at noon with a county supervisor in a white truck. I gave them the log and walked them through the fault, the manual reset, and the marks on the footing. The supervisor looked at the dust, looked at the tower, and decided the site needed a rigor inspection before the next storm cell. That was sensible. Bureaucracies can only process what has a maintenance category. Lena waited until he was on the other side of the yard before asking, "Did you see it on the ground?" "Not clearly." "That's enough." "What is it?" I asked again. She looked up the tower, following the red lamps even in daylight, as if measuring an invisible line between them. "I think it uses the tower the way some things use wells," she said. "That's the best wording I have." I did not ask what that meant. It seemed unlikely she had a better wording behind it. The company rotated me off the site 4 days later. Officially, it was because the storm season was intensifying, and they wanted a 2-person team on nights until the inspection could be completed. Unofficially, I think Lena had told them enough to make my replacement a shared shift instead of a solitary one. I handed over the keys, the monitor logs, and the notebook. The notebook came back to me anyway. 2 weeks after I was home, a padded company envelope arrived with my final timesheet, a mileage check, and the spiral notebook folded inside. No note. No explanation. Just the same page of rules, with one new line added below Rule 4 in handwriting I did not recognize. If it reaches the gravel, the tower is already too familiar with you. I called the office and asked who had sent it. The payroll clerk said no notebook had been in the mailing packet when it left. She sounded bored, not secretive. I believed her. That winter, a rigor report on the site circulated through a few people I knew. Most of it was ordinary. Corrosion at several joints, paint loss, one damaged lamp cage near the upper section. But in the remarks column, under a note about residue found inside the lower lattice, someone had written, "Unidentified pale mineral dust present above expected wind line. No apparent source." The site remained active. It had to. Rural systems stay in service because there is nothing else to take their place. Weather alerts still have to cross empty distances. County traffic still needs repeaters. Music stations still like height. I never went back to the basin, though once, driving south on a state road long after my contract ended, I saw a tower 20 miles off in the evening and caught myself counting its red lamps before I knew I was doing it. I still work in telecom, though not nights if I can avoid them. People ask why I turned down tower contracts, and I usually say I prefer indoor systems now. That is close enough to true. What I think, when I am being honest with myself, is simpler. Structures get used by more than the people who build them. Most of the time, that only means birds in the cross-bracing, wasps under the junction boxes, wind finding one loose panel and teaching it a note. Sometimes it means the job has a pattern no training manual includes, and the best anyone can do is leave a page in a notebook for the next person and hope they are disciplined enough to follow it. I kept that page, not because I expect to need it again, only because the rules were precise, and precision usually comes from repetition. There is one more thing. About 6 months after I left, I got a brief call from a number I did not know. The line was clear, but the speaker sounded as though he were outdoors. He gave his name, which I did not catch, and said he was on the new night rotation at the site. He asked if I had ever noticed the tower lights seeming closer to the ground after storms. I told him no. There was a short pause. Then he said, in a careful, neutral voice, "All right, I thought I should ask." I almost told him about the notebook. I almost told him to watch the beacon rhythm instead of reaching for the floodlight, to leave the sand alone until sunrise, to stay out of the yard when the steel began to ring. Instead, I said the line was breaking up and that he should call the day tech. He thanked me and hung up. Sometimes I wonder if that was unkind. Other times I think the opposite. Advice only helps when someone is ready to treat it as instruction and not as a story. As far as I know, the tower is still there. In satellite photos, the site looks small and harmless. Just a square of fence and a narrow vertical casting a short afternoon shadow across pale ground. The official records will list outages, inspections, fuel deliveries, and the dates of lamp replacements. They will not mention the white dust above the expected wind line. They will not mention the way the structure carried weight on windless nights. They will not mention that the top light sometimes disappeared, not because it failed, but because something passed slowly in front of it. That part belongs to the people who stayed there long enough to notice patterns. If you spend enough nights around one tall object in an empty place, you begin to understand that height is not neutral. It attracts weather, birds, attention, electrical charge, and whatever else prefers a narrow path above the level ground. I still think of the tower sometimes just before sleep, not because the memory is vivid, but because it was orderly. Red lamp, dark, red lamp, dark. A sound climbing through steel at a pace too steady to be accidental, and somewhere above the third light, where the structure narrowed and the desert gave way to sky, a part of the night that behaved like it had found the right shape and intended to keep using it.